Class 180 Golden Doves, page 103. The other term examined by Hazan is Eno Nitan Lehikatev. So you remember we were examining the term Devarim Shebichtav Yatarashai Leomram Alpe, Devarim Shebe'alpe Yatarashai Leomram Albichtav. But then there's also a similar expression, Eno Nitan Lehikatev. What does it mean? Eno nitan lekatev. It was not consigned for writing. So Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazan examines this term, and my father examines Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazan. So Hazan noted that when referring to writing down unauthorized material, meaning material, not that it's bad material, but it just hasn't been published as one of the official writings or official books of the Jewish nation. The rabbis never used the technical term asur. They said it's not forbidden to write it down, right? He's not authorized. Eno nitan. Or it doesn't say eno rashai. It's not authorized. It says eno nitan, to write down the oral or to recite the scriptures orally. So on the one hand, you're not allowed to write down the oral, so you can't write down and say this is an official copy of the Mishnayot. There is no official copy of the Mishnayot, in the sense that the Mishnayot is considered an oral text, not a written text. So even if you had an official copy of the Mishnayot, you wouldn't transmit it like you transmit a Sefer Torah. Transmit a Sefer Torah because it is nitan lehikatev. Right? So you can have an official copy. You can have a Mishnayot that's a very accurate version of the Mishnayot, but ultimately it has to be transmitted be'al peh. And similarly, scriptures. Let's say I know, Parashat Kitisa be'al peh. So I'm going to transmit it, and then you write it. That's not the way it's supposed to be done. It's supposed to be written from another scroll, right? At least in one place, the rabbis applied to this case the expression "eno nitan lehikatev," right? So "eno nitan lehikatev," according. Yeah, I'm sorry. At least in one place, the rabbis applied to this case, right, the expression "eno nitan lehikatev." So the situation was, let me check the footnote, what it's referring to, footnote 12, Gittin 68. Let me take a look at that. Give me a moment. I'm sorry. This will take hopefully quickly. So let's see what we have in Masechet Gittin, Daf Samech Amud Bet. We open up the Gemara now. I apologize for this lapse in the recording, in the sense that nothing really is taking place other than me talking to myself. Okay, here goes. Gittin Samech. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Samech A. Let's see. Interesting. There's a series of interesting. Let's read part of this. Let's read part of this sugya. I think it would be useful. So. אתה שלחו לבני גליל לרבי חלבו, מהו לקרות בחומשים בבית הכנסת בסיבור. So you have these chumashim which are similar to the chumashim we have today in the Knis, right? So instead of an official scroll where you write it down following all the rules of Ketivat Sefer Torah, you have this chumashim written down on paper, let's say, right? Can you read the Torah from one of these chumashim? La va biyadeh. Ata shaileh Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. La va biyadeh. Ata sha'id b'midrasha. ופשטוה מהדם רבי שמואל בן נחמני על רבי יוחנן ספר תורה שחסר יריעה אחת and Korin Bo. So a Sefer Torah that's missing one of the sheets, one of the pages, it's haram to read from it. From here we would say that the Chumash, it's only one of the Chumashim. It's Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, right? So apparently you can't read from it. It says Velahi. but that was not a correct argument. Hata mehasser b'milte. Hachala mehasser b'milte. Right, so it says it's just not a correct argument because it's in the Sefer Torah, it's a defective Sefer Torah. It's mehasser b'milte. But these Humashim are not defective. This is the way they were written. Okay, I want to see. Okay. Yeah, I think we're getting somewhere. ולבא ואליו יוסף דאמר לתרווי, היי ספר הפטרתה, אסור למקרה בשבת, מה יתאמר דלה ניתן לכתב. Interesting. It says that you can't read the Sefer Haftarot on Shabbat because it wasn't consigned for writing. Interesting. So it wasn't lo nitan likatev. So here you see the relationship. I think this was the point that my father was making. When you transmit a text, how do you transmit the text? So since this Sefer Haftarot, for some reason, and we don't need to examine the reason, was not nitan likatev, therefore you can't publicly read the text from the writing because this isn't supposed to be written down, right? Lo nitan likatev. So lo nitan likatev has to do not with whether you physically wrote it, they physically wrote it, but what is the status of this text? And the answer is lo nitan likatev. So since lo nitan likatev, you can't, for example, publicly read it as a written text, as you would read, let's say, any of the Parashat HaShavua, nitan likatev, and therefore you read it in public with ta'amim. But this, no, lo nitan likatev. So you see the idea of nitan or lo nitan likatev doesn't have to do with whether it was written, it has to do with what is the status, and therefore may you or may you not, for example, read it b'sibur. According to Rabbi Hazan, the expression used elsewhere by the rabbis in conjunction with the oral recitation of scripture and the writing of the oral law are the semantic equivalent of the eno nitan likatev, not of asur or eno rashai. Right. So Rabbi Moshe Hazan draws an equivalency between, or some sort of relationship between when the Chachamim speak about the oral recitation of the Chumash or the physical writing of the oral law, right? So the oral recitation of the Chumash is Devarim she bichtav yatarashai yom lamal peh. So you can't do that, right? So you see that all these things are related, right? So eno nitan likatev doesn't mean asur or eno rashai, right? This is a legal term. In order to understand its precise sense, we must remember that rabbinic legislation distinguishes between two classes of loans or debts. One which is be'al peh, orally, that is contracted verbally, and another which is bishta, documented, that is contracted in a written document. This really is a brilliant passage we're about to read. So the Jewish law recognizes milva al peh, which means oral loan, and milva bichtav, or bishtav, which means a written loan. Hazan analyzed a passage in the Babylonian Talmud discussing the liability of an individual who sold a property that he had previously transferred to his son. So he previously transferred the property to his son, but then he sells it to a third party. The issue debated by the rabbis concerned the liability of the seller, right? The father, obviously. He committed a fraud. According to some, this is to be considered a documented debt. The bill of sale that he had written documents his liability. So he wrote a shetar mechira, and that's a written document. It's a physical writing. So therefore it should have the status of a shetar. That's how the Gemara says. The final conclusion is that since the bill that he had written אינו ניתן להיכתב. It does not have the force of a written document, and it must be considered as an oral contract, even though there is a physical writing, but it doesn't have the status of a written document, and therefore you would treat it as a be'al peh agreement. Or Hazan points out another passage, and there's of course, and there are consequences in Jewish law whether a transaction was an oral transaction or a written transaction. For example, whether you can can you remove the property from other people who bought that property, right? So if you have a written document, the answer is yes, you may. If it's oral, no, you may not. So you see how the question of writing versus oral is a legal question. It's not a physical reality question. We're not saying, is there a written piece of paper or is there not a written piece of paper? But we're saying this writing, does it have the status of a written document or does it have the status of an oral document? For the sake of illustration, it would help to examine a passage in Ketuvot 102b concerning the liability of parents who promise financial help to their children before their wedding ceremony. The Talmud concludes that this type of liability, and again, it could be that it was written down, but it doesn't matter. It still has the status of an oral promise, let's say, or statement. Therefore, Maimonides declared that even if a written document was drawn up at the time of the wedding, registering the parent's promise, the contract must be considered oral. Thus, it becomes clear that this term does not indicate whether the actual writing of the document is permitted, but rather the status of such a document. In the case of the parent's promise discussed above, there is no objection against the actual drawing up of such a document. If the parents want to draw up a document, they can. But the document will still have the status of an oral promise. The sole concern is the status of the document containing something which was not authorized for registration in writing, and therefore would have consequences if they gave their property to somebody else. Can the children then take the property from the other person? Well, if it's an oral document, the answer would be no.